Friday the 13th, Church of the Divine Psychopath. Chapter 13. The old wooden floorboards of the cafeteria had greedily swallowed up the blood that had been spilled across their surface. Someone had tried to wipe up what they could, but had only succeeded in spreading the stains further. The dark smears were all the evidence that remained of Jason's rampage through the cafeteria. Most of the metal folding chairs were back in place, and the smashed window that Don James had dived through was now shuttered. Even the cross Jason had hung profanely upon was gone. Morbidly, Meredith glanced around the room, checking shadowy corners and the bases of the walls to see if, perhaps, her dad's eyeball had somehow been left behind. Was it looking at her right now? Where were the bodies, and the pieces of bodies? What would her dad think, seeing her there with Mr. Rickles' arm around her? She hoped he wouldn't be happy about the potential husband material, but then again, Father Long had duped her dad, and he was even worse. Even more evil. Maybe her parents would have thought Mr. Rickles would make a great son-in-law. She tried to force herself to think about something else, but Rickles' touch made that impossible. Rickles and some of the other men had gathered around the congregation from the cabins and led them to the cafeteria. Meredith still refused to call it a church, but that was the name everyone else gave it. As they walked through the dark campground to the big cabin, Rickles had slipped his arm around Meredith and drawn her close. Walking that way, he guided her steps almost like a sheepdog, steering her slightly away from the group and slowing her down to let the others pull ahead somewhat. Not so anyone would notice, of course, after all. That was Mr. Rickles' way. But enough for him to have the privacy the night allowed him, enough that he could slip his hand up under the tail of her shirt without anyone seeing. Meredith had suffered in silence as he wriggled his fingers into the waistband of her jeans and down into her panties, his fingertips tangling in her pubic hair. "I'll bet it's just as red as the hair on your purty little head," he had muttered into her ear. Try as he might, Rickles hadn't been able to work his hand far enough into her pants to touch what he wanted. But she knew he'd remedy that before the night was over. "I want you to sleep in my cabin tonight," he'd whispered to her as they climbed the steps to the cafeteria, "so I can protect you." She hadn't said anything in response. What was the point? Mr. Rickles would get everything that he wanted. She was his reward, wasn't she? Standing at the back of the cafeteria near the door, Meredith counted the people seated in the room. At least a dozen were missing, all dead, in one night. She wondered how many Jason Voorhees had actually killed and how many had died fighting the soldiers. Her eyes fell on Father Long, seated at the head of the room in a big chair she recognized from the main cabin. Don James stood nearby, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Father Long's shirt was off, and he was slumped in the chair like a decadent king, a malicious grin on his face. His exposed skin glistened with sweat. Meredith wondered if Kelly had ever seen Long with his shirt off. His torso was lean and wiry, like a racing dog's, and there was a big scar on his belly, probably from having his appendix removed. Would Kelly have thought that this looked sexy? Meredith just thought he was disgusting. "I think we're all here, Curtis," Long said. "Close the door, please." Everyone turned to watch Rickles shut the door. Meredith studied their faces. None of them looked scared. Could they possibly be that stupid, that misguided, that they didn't even fear this man or feel anger at what he had inflicted on them? Rickles rejoined Meredith. He immediately placed his arm around her again, his rough fingers finding their way beneath her shirt to scrape across her belly. She looked up at him, and he gave her the toothless smile. She wondered if he mistook her shudder of revulsion for one of pleasure. Father Long steepled his fingers and contemplated his flock for a long moment. "I thank you all for joining me here in the church tonight," he began, as if anyone had any choice in the matter. "You're probably wondering why I brought you back here. What with the late hour and all." Speaking loudly, he pitched his voice for the back rows. "The reason we've returned to the church is, well, we're here to celebrate heroes and to mourn the souls of sinners." Meredith heard someone, a woman, begin crying, but she couldn't pick her out among the congregation. Was her husband a sinner or a hero? "Curtis, you're one of those heroes," Long said, gesturing to the ex-Marine. "Please join us up here." Rickles beamed proudly at Meredith. She managed to smile in return, losing it as he kissed her cheek. Then, accompanied by a smattering of applause from the congregation, Rickles trotted up the aisle to where Father Long sat. Meredith remained standing at the back of the room, watching as Rickles swapped a handshake with Don James and the two men settled into position on either side of Father Long's makeshift throne. Dedicated lapdogs. The applause continued and finally ceased when Long gestured for a quiet. "And let us not forget about those heroes who fell in the battle," Long added. "Manny Crinkle." The applause began again, slowly at first, but building as each name was spoken. "Ronald Sheeran. Joseph Bookwalter." Closing his eyes, Long allowed the applause to go on for several moments before signaling for silence again. "They died proudly fighting for what they knew to be true. They died in a manner befitting their role as prophets of a new age." Father Long stood, stretching his arms above his head. Meredith watched the ropey muscles flex along the length of his sweat-drenched torso. Like everything else he did, Long played the movement to his flock, turning a simple stretch into Shakespearean drama, just like the plays I used to endure in high school, Meredith thought. Only those usually ended with a party for the theater nerds instead of in mass slaughter. Concluding the little performance with a final twist of his shoulders, Long somberly faced his followers. "I wish I could tell you that it's over," he said, "that we've won our freedom. But I've told you many times of the fate of prophets throughout history. And you also know that I would never lie to you." He hung his head and trailed his fingers through the sweat on his brow. "They'll be back. The men who would rob us of our faith." Looking up at the congregation again, Long gave them the tiniest of smiles. "I'm sorry. I should stand before you at a time like this, but I'm afraid I'm very weary tonight." He returned to his chair, settling into the seat. Back to the throne, Meredith thought. Long didn't look weary at all to her. On the contrary, he seemed vibrant and mysterious. Charismatic, that was the word for it. The fatigue was just more of his theatrics, an effort to draw in the crowd. Looking around the room, she could see that it was working. Nearly everyone was leaning forward in their seats, mesmerized by the preacher. "We're entering a new phase," Long continued. "We can't win the battle, not with guns or grenades or weapons of any kind, except faith. Our faith is the greatest and only weapon." A chorus of amens went up from the gathered flock. "We've driven them away for now, but the Lord gave us the element of surprise in that first battle." Smiling, Long gestured to the men on either side of the chair. "The Lord, along with Curtis Rickles and Don James." Meredith was sickened to hear a few laughs scattered throughout the congregation. "With the Lord and these two men on our side, we may be able to drive the unbelievers away again. We might be able to keep them at bay for weeks, perhaps even months. Remember Brother Koresh and his followers in Texas all those years ago? But from that incident, we also know they'll keep coming back, with more and more men, more and more weapons, until they destroy all of us and every last thing we believe in." Father Long paused, closing his eyes, leaning back in his chair. He worked his fingers into his brow, then continued. "I don't say these things to dishearten you or to weaken your resolve. I say these things to prepare you for what lies ahead. Again, I say that I will not lie to you." Still resting his head against the soft back of the chair, Long gazed out at his followers, his eyes dark and severe. "And so we enter a phase of cleansing. It's already begun with Jason Voorhees, the hand of God, performing his glorious task. Knowing what we face in the days ahead, we must prepare ourselves. All of us must take up arms, both literal and spiritual, against our oppressors, if we are to find place in the promised land." As Long spoke, Meredith found herself staring at Mr. Rickles. In several moments the man hadn't looked at her once. His attention instead focused on the congregation. She continued to watch him throughout the pause in Father Long's sermon. As the preacher gathered himself for the next barrage of hideous lies he was spouting, Mr. Rickles paid no attention to her. Could she do it slowly? Hesitantly, Meredith shifted her right foot, sliding it backwards across the floorboards and towards the door. Long pushed himself forward in his chair. "Those three men who were killed in the battle tonight, Manny, Ronald, Joseph, they left behind beloved wives." Meredith heard at least one of those wives sniffling loudly, but kept her eyes glued to Rickles. Still, the man didn't look in her direction. Cautiously, she slid her foot backwards, trying hard to shift the weight of her body without it being obvious. Father Long stood again, seeking out the wives of the dead men. 3 women who, if they were anywhere else, would be alone now. The preacher smiled lovingly. But not here. No one is alone in the ministry of the heavenly vessel. And tonight, I will take these women to my side, and I will make them my own beloved wives, guide their spiritual journey through these difficult days. Rickles' eyes flickered towards Meredith. Of course, all of this talk of beloved wives made him want to see his own. She smiled pleasantly at him, even as she carefully continued to inch towards the door. Long spread his arms wide, offering his cleansing love to the widows he addressed. Patricia Crinkle, Susanna Bookwalter, Christine Shearing, please come to my side, accept my guidance, and accept my love. The 3 women slowly rose to their feet, looking around at one another. Unsure, Patricia Crinkle was the first to move forwards. She went to Father Long, her decision apparently making up the minds of the others. Soon all 3 of them were walking up the aisle and blocking Meredith's view of Rickles, which means he can't see me, right? Right. If you can't see my mirrors, I can't see you, like the little sign on the rear ends of semi-trucks always said. Long's parade of brides had almost reached him, and Rickles' ugly head kept bobbing into view as the women moved. It was now or never. Holding her breath, Meredith slipped quietly out the door. Say again, strike team? The static leaden voice crackled on the other end of the radio. Hobb, with his forehead neatly bandaged and his right eye once again swollen to hideous proportions, sat in the lab that Noon and the others had been in. He gripped the radio's microphone, trying to rein in his temper. It was barely working, and with all the static he might as well have been speaking Swedish. I said, we have 6 men dead. Noon, who was seated on one of the benches in the crew compartment, interrupted. 7. Tough girl that she was, she had only been unconscious for a couple of minutes following Hobbs' assault on her face. Ever since she'd regained consciousness, she'd been almost tame. She was even allowing Mosley to tend her various wounds, with only the occasional complaint when he touched something that was particularly tender. Hobb released the microphone key. Fuck, he said. Who? Howard took a slug during the... On her way back to the lab, Noon said. She couldn't quite wrap her lips around the word retreat. Hobb squeezed the mic's key again. Correction, that is 7 men dead, 3 wounded. I'm not wounded, Noon said. You didn't fucking wound me. Hobb continued speaking into the mic. We have engaged the target and suffered casualties. In addition, we're facing armed resistance from an estimated 25 to 40 individuals. We are in need of reinforcements. Repeat, we are in need of reinforcements. Over. Hobb glanced at Kelly while he waited for a response. She was seated on one of the benches at the front of the crew compartment. She did not want to be too close to the hatch in the darkness beyond it. He couldn't really blame her. He had heard sporadic clunking from somewhere under the lav. Static erupted from the radio as the response came. Say again, strike team? Jesus, Hobb snarled, tossing the mic down. Standing, he walked to the back of the lab, staring out at the highway. You live here, he began, turning to face Kelly. Isn't there any goddamn traffic on this road? Kelly shrugged. If one of us could just hitch a ride back to town, make a fucking phone call. You just said Jesus, goddamn, and fuck to a religious woman, Noon said, reprimanding her new commanding officer. We've been over this already, and you know what I have to say about it. Thrill me, Noon said. Fuck a bunch of goddamn Jesuses. Noon cocked a thumb at the floor of the lab, whistling. Straight to hell for you. I've been on that bus for a long time, Kelly assured the rough woman. Noon smiled. I think I'm holding a ticket for that ride myself, darling. I'm glad we're all such great fucking friends around here, Hobb snapped. He gave the 2 women a sour look and stomped down the ramp, disappearing around the side of the lav. What's up his rectum? Noon asked. Gee, I don't know, Kelly said. Maybe you should take a wild fucking guess. Outside, Hobb walked to the front of the lav, stopping where a pair of legs protruded from beneath the armored transports. He was beginning to think Noon was easier to tolerate when she was being a complete dick to him. Ever since he'd beat her in that fight, she'd been talkative as hell, and it was getting on his fucking nerves. He squatted next to the pair of legs. Any luck? Only bad luck, sir. Chapin wriggled out from under the vehicle, sitting up. His pudgy face and hands were smeared with grease. 2 of the axles are sheared through. We might be able to drive the beast, but she'd sure as hell put up a fight along the way. Not sure we'd make it very far, sir. How perfectly typical, Hobb thought. He looked around at the other operators milling about on the blacktop. 12 men left, minus Atchison, who was back at the base camp with the one functioning lav, and 2 of them were wounded. Lovinger's gunshot wound was fairly minor, or at least as minor as a large caliber chunk of lead punching into your thigh can be. Blair, on the other hand, had lost blood when Jason took a swing at him with the machete. Of course, the bright side of that was that most people didn't meet the big psycho and live to tell about it. Blair, sitting on the pavement and resting against one of the lav's huge tires, was putting up a good front, but he was pale as a ghost and too weak to be much good to the strike team in the field. The other men were fidgeting with their weapons and constantly giving ancient looks at Hobb. Hobb was uncertain whether or not he could hold things together, keep the team functioning. Lifting a hand, he prodded carefully at the tender, swollen flesh around his right eye. Noon's rampant pounding had really inflamed it, and he was back to being, to all intents and purposes, blind on that side. He hoped her breast was puffed up 2 sizes too big for her bra. "Sir?" Chaffin said, jarring Hobb from his thoughts. He turned to face the stocky operator. "Do you think one of us should try to walk back to base camp and bring back the other lav?" "Yeah, let's send someone off to be slaughtered by Jason Voorhees," Hobb pondered for a moment. "Maybe they should all hump it back to base camp. Try to call for reinforcements from the 3rd lav. The trouble was, none of the radios had worked for a good goddamn since they'd arrived at Crystal Lake. Some sort of atmospheric shit of some kind, he thought. In any case, if they all made the hike back to base camp, they might find themselves in the same boat they were already drifting in. But at the base camp, they'd be able to pack it into the working lab and get the fuck out of there. Which was no option at all. Cut and run wasn't exactly Hobbs' style. And things would have to get a hell of a lot worse before he'd even begin to consider such a tactic. "I don't think that would be safe," Hobb finally answered. Chaffin studied him for a second. "Excuse me, sir? But what is?" "I'm willing to volunteer. I'll make the walk myself." Hobb cut him off. "I need every able-bodied man with me." "But if we had the other lab, sir..." "That's a half-hour drive going full-tilt boogie in one of those things," Hobb said, cocking a thumb at the damaged lab. "How long a walk is that going to be?" "I can cut through the woods, follow the lake around," Chaffin said. Hobb stared at him. "You're going to cut through the fucking woods? Really?" "Why not? I mean, I'm a beefy guy, but I can move when I need to." Hobb patted him on the shoulder. "With all due respect, Chaffin, I think you're missing the point. No one's going into the goddamn woods by themselves." Frustrated, Chaffin frowned. He began to say something else, but Hobb interrupted with a gesture. "I appreciate the offer, but what I need you to do is get your gear together and round everyone up for me." Chaffin gave a sharp nod. "Yes, sir." Hobb walked to the back of the armored transport, peering into the crew compartment at Samantha Noon and the others. "Noon, we've got a hat up. I want Lovinger and Blair to stay with the lab. They can keep trying to raise Atchison on the radio. Maybe get us some help." Noon shoved Mosley aside and stood, moving to follow orders. Hobb looked at Kelly. "Don't get any ideas. You're staying too," he told her. "Not a chance," Kelly said, getting to her feet and staring at the hatch. Hobb winced. "Don't. Please don't. Don't start. All right? I shouldn't even have to say the words." "Then don't." She stood on the ramp, daring him to do something about it. "It's dangerous out there," Hobb recited as if reading from a script. "And I was in a room with Jason Voorhees not 3 hours ago," Kelly said. "I know those people, Ham." "Hobb," he corrected. A look of embarrassment flashed across her face. "Hobb, maybe I can help talk sense into some of them." She hesitated. And I've got to see if Meredith's okay. Try to help her get out of there," she added quietly. "I have concerns for your safety," Hobb muttered, resigned to what he knew was coming. "Fuck you," Kelly said, stomping past him down the ramp. Back at the strike team's base camp, Operator Atchison was packed uncomfortably into the crew compartment of the 3rd lav, his ass wedged onto a narrow strip of bench. He could barely move thanks to the metal lockboxes stacked floor to ceiling. Hell, he couldn't even put his arms out straight in any direction. And to make matters worse, his foot was giving him fits. Grunting, Atchison struggled to get his foot up on the bench, finally grabbing his ankle and lifting the damn thing by hand. As he went to untie the boot, he gave his elbow a painful crack on one of the lockboxes. Fuck it. He didn't have room to change his mind in here, let alone deal with his foot. Besides, he had a shotgun, didn't he? Working himself along the bench, he reached up to slam the heel of his hand onto the lock in the rear of the hatch. He pushed the hatch open, the metal plate dropping into the dirt with a soft thud. Scooting a little further down the bench, Atchison peeked around the side of the lav. "Yoo-hoo, motherfucker," he said softly. He slid off the bench, crouching on the ramp. He winced at the pain in his foot, hissing softly. As the jolt of intense agony eased somewhat, he opened his eyes and looked around. Dark as a nun's ass crack out there, he thought. Unfortunately, all the night vision goggles were in the other transports. Atchison reached back to grab his shotgun and cocked it. The sound was exceptionally loud and equally satisfying. "Mr. Voorhees," he called quietly to the darkness. Rising, Atchison limped to the bottom of the ramp and stepped off into the soft dirt. It was pretty spooky standing alone, but at least he could limp without anyone seeing him. It had taken a lot out of him being so stoic. Nowhere to sit, story of his life. Painfully hopping up the ramp, he grabbed one of the lockboxes and carried it back down. Atchison hopped a few paces away from the lab and set the lockbox on edge, within the circle of light spilling from the crew compartment of the transport. Then he planted his ass on the box, facing the lab. "With my back to the woods," he thought. Shifting, he worked his way around so he was angled in such a way that the light still fell where he needed it, but he could get a better view of his surroundings. Bending, he began the slow process of unlacing the combat boot. He should have set this one out. If he'd been smart, he'd be kicked back on the sofa right now with a beer in one hand and a remote in the other, watching Game of Thrones or something. Maybe even could have convinced Gretchen to come over. Sometimes when he was sick, she'd give him a blowjob. Boy, he could use one of those right about now. It was such a pathetic injury, though. He never would have lived it down if the other operators had found out about it. That's why he'd done such a manly job of keeping it secret, even though his foot was constantly throbbing and sending stabbing pains up his leg. Atchison pulled the laces loose all the way down to the boot, trying to give his foot as much room as possible before he slipped the boot off. "Oh man, is this going to hurt," he thought. Gritting his teeth, he took hold of the boot and pulled it off slowly. As his toes scraped along the leather, he stifled a howl. When the boot was off, he hurled it aside, never wanting to lay eyes on it again. Breathing hard, he examined his sock. The stink made his lip curl. It looked like someone had injected Crisco and chicken blood into his sock. Atchison figured the real damage had been done when he ran down to the water's edge with Ortega and Hurley to see what was going on at Camp Crystal Lake. He'd had to fight to keep from screaming then, but he felt like he'd put on a pretty good show, under the circumstances. Real Academy Award material. Where's my Oscar? Huffing a few times as he worked to screw up his courage, Atchison began peeling the sock down. It was fine until he got it over his heel. Then he realized it was glued to the wound with blood and pus. Gagging, he looked around, not quite sure what he was looking for. Help, he guessed. He needed to get the sock loose. The lake! It was a long hop down to the water, but he couldn't see any other way. Using his shotgun as a brace, Atchison shoved himself up onto his uninjured foot. Steeling himself, he started hopping. Atchison had been doing wheelies on a bike he'd borrowed from a kid who lived down the block, and he had been barefoot and a little drunk. But when he settled his ass down on that old-school banana seat and leaned back against the sissy bar, he just couldn't help himself. He started popping wheelies and riding them around just like when he was a little kid, and he'd been happy to tell anyone who wanted to listen that he still had the old magic. Okay, so he couldn't figure out how he had managed to jam his toes into the spokes of the back wheel, but it hurt. The skin was shredded like he'd used a cheese grater on it, and 2 of the toenails had peeled off immediately, while the others were slowly lifting away from the toes of their own accord. Atchison figured he'd seen worse, and so didn't bother going to the doctor. The infection had taken hold pretty quickly, though. He paused, leaning against a tree, and looked back towards the lav. He was making good time, and the transport was already a good distance behind him. Of course, so was the light. He peered into the dark woods, looking for movement. "Jason? You out there, buddy?" Silence. Then he heard a loud crack. Atchison jumped, bringing his shotgun up. Somewhere up in the treetops, something thumped. Leaves rustled. Atchison relaxed. A broken branch was making its way down from above. He watched it fall the last dozen feet or so to the ground as it bounced off a lower limb and thudded into the dirt. Jason doesn't climb trees, he thought. Breathing again, Atchison went back to hopping. Reaching the loose sand near the water's edge, he lost his balance and fell, jamming his injured foot into the dirt. He let out a short cry of pain, biting it off. Cursing through clenched teeth, he rolled onto his back and grabbed his ankle, lying there until the pain eased enough for him to move. He stared up at the sky. Fuck, what's going on, he wondered. Why hasn't anyone bothered to radio in and give me the goddamn poop? Oh yeah, radio doesn't work. Whose idea was this piece of shit clusterfuck anyways? Atchison felt like he might enjoy watching them eat his pus-soaked, smelly sock if he could ever get it off his nasty-ass foot. Carefully shielding his foot, he sat up and looked out across the lake. There were a few lights burning at Camp Crystal Lake, but no sign of any activity. Pushing himself to his feet, Atchison hopped the rest of the way to the water and plopped down on his ass at its edge. Tiny waves lapped gently at his legs. The water was cold, and he was beginning to have second thoughts. How many parasites and deadly organisms are going to crawl up inside of me when I do this? He shrugged the idea away. Anything was better than hopping around with his sock glued to his crusty toes. Holding his breath, he plunged his foot into the water, his butt cheeks clenching at the sudden chill. Then he noticed his shotgun lying next to him, the waves washing over it. "Damn it!" he hissed, grabbing the gun and tossing it a few feet farther up the bank out of the water's reach. Returning his attention to his foot, Atchison lifted the loose part of his sock and tugged gently, still stuck. He wiggled his toes. He wasn't quite sure he could actually feel them anymore, but he assumed if they still hurt as bad as they did, that they couldn't be dead yet. He swished his foot around, continuing to pull at his sock, the fabric slowly beginning to lift away from the pus and blood. Grimacing, he peeled the sock loose and flung it aside, then leaned in close to examine it. 3 of his toenails were entirely gone. The nail on his big toe clung to the piggy by a tiny strand of pasty white flesh, thick yellowish crud collecting around it. The little toenail was loose. With his index finger, Atchison lifted it back carefully, revealing the bruised and bloated meat underneath. All 5 of his toes and the top of his foot were ragged and ill-looking, the skin torn up and mottled with various shades of bruised purple and black. It looked like he had spread a layer of ground beef across the surface of his foot, and it had gone bad days ago. Atchison's stomach turned. The telltale streaks of infection ran from the wound up his ankle, like lines on a road map. He was going to have to bite the bullet and show it to Mosley when the strike team came back, and see if the guy could give him some antibiotics. Daintily, Atchison grabbed the loose nail on his big toe and tugged at it to test the strength of the skin that held it on. The toenail came away like nothing, and he held it up to his face, turning it this way and that to check it out. It was yellow and rigid, like it came from an old man, and there was a coating of cheese-like white goop on its underside. No wonder Gretchen would never agree to suck his toes, he thought. Letting out a snort of disgust, he flicked the nail away out into Crystal Lake. It hit the water and floated for a second before a dark shape broke the surface, splashed once and was gone, taking the toenail with it. A fish, Atchison realized. Goddamn fish ate my toenail. Then he stared at his foot, resting beneath the rippling surface of the lake, the water lapping around his ankle. The torn strips of skin and meat waggled in the current, just like worms on a hook. Atchison quickly yanked his foot from the water and scooted back on the bank. He'd once seen a television show about some primitive people who treated infected limbs by submerging them in a river and allowing the fish to eat the rotten parts away. But Atchison was a firm believer in modern medicine. No goddamn trout is going to nibble my nasty toes, he thought. He heard a loud crack from somewhere behind. Atchison whipped his head around. He stared wide-eyed over his shoulder into the dark woods. Another dead tree branch? He waited for a few moments, expecting to hear the branch falling through the trees. Nothing. Just the gentle lapping of the waves. No, scratch that. Something was moving out there, just beyond the tree line. Keeping his eyes on the woods, Atchison reached for his shotgun but came up with nothing but wet sand. He glanced around, feeling anxious. He spun, searching the darkness around him. His gaze fell on the shotgun, which looked like nothing more than a tree branch. It was about 5 yards away from Atchison, where he'd flung it, up on the bank to keep it out of the water. There was another sound from the trees. Atchison's breath caught in his throat. If it wasn't for the pale moonlight filtering through the trees, reflecting off the filthy white hockey mask, he might not have recognized the dark shape as Jason Voorhees. Although the machete gripped in the lunatic's right hand was a pretty good indicator. Atchison shoved himself upright, nearly shrieking as his weight came down on his injured foot. Half running, half crawling, he scurried up the bank to where his shotgun lay in the sand. Jason stepped from the tree line, striding towards him, casually raising his machete. On his hands and knees, Atchison snatched up his shotgun and whirled towards the approaching killer. His bad foot scraped across the sand and peeling rotten flesh from the wound. Howling in agony, Atchison pulled the trigger. The buckshot peppered Jason's left shoulder and neck, a few pellets punching small round holes in his mask. His head and upper body snapped back under the impact. The hulking maniac staggered a little, then steadied, focusing on his prey once again. Atchison, the throbbing pain in his tortured foot bringing tears, stared into the yellow eyes that peered at him from within the hockey mask. The lav. He had to make it to the lav. Lock himself in there and see how the psycho liked having a few inches of armor plate between him and his intended victim. Atchison's fingers squeezed the trigger again. The shotgun spat flame and ripped into Jason's gut, shredding his moldering shirt and the flesh beneath. The madman reeled backwards but stayed on his feet, which was more than Atchison could do. The instant he fired the round, he pushed himself up and tried to run, but his wounded foot sent spikes of pain slamming up his leg, and he tumbled to the ground again, gasping. The shotgun slipped from his grasp, skidding away in the sand. Atchison looked in terror towards Jason. The machete-wielding murderer was examining his newest shotgun wound curiously, his head slowly tilting back and forth. Thick black blood spilled from the torn flesh, dribbling down his front. Run your ass off, Atchison thought. Now! Snarling with the effort, he heaved himself upright again, with his bad foot raised behind him. He started hopping towards the trees in the strike team's base camp. Jason Voorhees looked up, his grip tightening on the handle of his machete as he saw the prey trying to escape. Atchison reached the tree line, wobbling crazily with every hop, his arms pinwheeling at his sides. It was never going to work. He couldn't balance, and his footing was becoming more treacherous. He risked a glance back over his shoulder. Jason was closing in on him. That big bitch is just walking, that's all, he thought. Like he's out for a Sunday fucking stroll. The killer was narrowing the gap between himself and Atchison, as if the operator weren't even moving. Atchison saw the machete blade rise. His bad foot came down hard. His knee weakened as a volcanic eruption of pure agony surged upwards through his leg, but he somehow stayed on his feet. The pain tore through his body, screaming upwards until it rattled against the inside of his skull and pressed against the back of his eyeballs. Jason was only a few feet behind him now. Atchison's bad foot slammed into the ground again, this time coming down on a dead tree branch. Something sharp entered the flesh on the bottom of his foot. His vision darkened for an instant, and he nearly fell, slowing for only a moment. Then he could see the lab just a dozen yards away. Jason swung the machete. The blade entered the left side of Atchison's torso, between the fifth and sixth ribs, shattering one of them and sinking into the lung. Fire tore through his chest as the wind went out of him. Atchison pitched forward, his sudden movement yanking the machete from Jason's grip. The blade, however, remained lodged between Atchison's ribs as he tumbled face first to the ground. The tip of the machete dug a hole in the dirt, jamming the blade deeper into Atchison's chest and ripping a wider gash in his collapsed lung. Through all the pain in his torso, Atchison could still feel the stick that had punctured his right foot, like a barnacle on the Titanic. Wheezing quietly as he sucked in a breath, Atchison stared ahead at the lab. Agonizing pain wrenched his upper body as he reached forward with his left hand, clutching at the ground. Pushing up with the same hand and shoving with his feet, he tried to crawl towards the transport. The machete blade gouged further into the dirt, twisting and scraping against his shattered ribs and forcing a whispery scream from Atchison's wrecked insides. He could hear Jason Voorhees coming up behind him. Don't look back, he thought. Just don't look back. He looked back. Jason stepped up next to him, pausing to gaze down at Atchison's writhing body. Atchison tried to crawl again, but the machete tore deeper into his chest, and he felt something come loose in there. Lying with the right side of his face pressed into the dirt and the leaves, he could feel the blood poiling beneath him. He noticed his boot resting in the dirt nearby, where he had tossed it earlier. Jason bent over him, gripping the handle of the machete. A long, painful gasp hissed from between Atchison's clenched teeth as the killer slowly tugged the blade free, the metal sliding across bone with a dull scraping sound. Atchison merely lay there for an excruciatingly long moment, waiting for the blade to strike again. Then the machete dropped to the dirt next to him. He stared at his own blood, which trickled down the blade. Then he twisted his head to look at Jason Voorhees standing over him, unmoving except for a slow, repetitive clenching of his thick, decayed fingers. The maniac stood there, gazing down at his victim. He's just going to watch me die, Atchison thought. He stared into the waxy yellow eyes that burned nebulously from the hockey mask eye slits. No way. Straining, Atchison made another torturous, determined effort to crawl towards the lab. If he was going to bleed to death, it was going to be while trying to make it to that goddamn transport and not just lying at the feet of Jason. But it was getting harder for him to draw breath. Atchison wondered if he might be drowning in his own blood. He had crawled for a distance of about 9 inches when Jason leaned over him. The killer's massive right hand closed over Atchison's left arm just below the shoulder. Atchison's mouth fell open as if to scream as Jason roughly yanked him upwards, but nothing came out. The lower half of his body remained on the ground. Holding him like that, Jason groped at Atchison's side with his left hand, his fingers burying into the machete wound. Atchison groaned horribly as Jason's fingers forced their way between the ribs there, digging deeper and deeper into the wound. With his fingers wedged firmly between the bones, Jason took a grip on Atchison's ribcage and tightened his hold on the man's upper arm. Effortlessly, the immense madman hoisted Atchison skyward, holding the wriggling body over his head, like King Kong Bundy, about to deliver a punishing body slam. Atchison shrieked in horrified torment as Jason slowly began pulling his torso apart, as if splitting a lobster to get at the meat. Bones splintered and cracked. Atchison felt his ribs separate from his sternum, heard something meaty and wet splatter on the ground beneath him. When Atchison stopped struggling, Jason dropped the limp body into the dirt. The killer stared down at the corpse for a moment, then shook the entrails from his shoes, retrieved his machete, and disappeared into the forest. The girl had run out on him. Rickles hadn't seen her leave the church because those 3 women had been blocking his view, but when the broads had reached the altar and were out of his damn way, he saw that Meredith was gone. At first he had thought she might have just taken a seat, but it only took a moment's glancing around the large room to see that that wasn't the case. "The little bitch has left me." "Well now, wait just a second," a little voice in his head admonished him. "That's no way to refer to the future mother of your children, asshole." And if he was going to make things work with Meredith, he needed to avoid being an asshole. The girl had been through a hell of a lot, and what she needed now was a whole lot of sweetness. Rickles figured he had plenty of that to offer. Of course, he'd have to find the girl first. Then he'd be sweet to her. She wouldn't know what hit her. Rickles was seated on the edge of the bed in the main cabin. One of the windows was blown out when that grenade had gone off right from outside during the gun battle, and the curtains were waving in the gentle breeze. The night air was a comfort to him. The machete wound on his arm hurt like hell, and the throbbing pain was making him feel hot. He eyed his bandaged forearm. The blood had almost completely soaked the gauze strips, but it seemed to have stopped, at least. He flexed his fingers, counting himself lucky that the blade hadn't severed anything too important. The breeze shifted slightly, carrying a pungent odor to Rickles' nostrils. He looked around the room, his eyes falling on his piss-soaked jeans. Rickles stood up, crossed the room, and picked up the moist pair of trousers, delicately between 2 of his fingers. He couldn't believe he'd pissed his pants when Jason Voorhees was after him, swinging that machete and staring at him with those cold, yellow eyes. He walked to the window and hurled the jeans out, listening to them hit the ground with a soft thump. Then he leaned against the windowsill and peered out into the night. As mad as he was at the girl for running off like she had, truth be known, he was worried sick about her being out there alone in the dark. She might have too much sin in her. She wouldn't escape Jason's judgment like he had, especially considering the disrespectful way she had spoken to Father Long earlier. That alone was probably enough to send her spiraling into the black depths. Still, he couldn't understand why the good father wouldn't let him go out and search for the girl. She just needed some proper attention to set her back on the straight and narrow once again. Bring her back to being the God-fearing youngster she was before the night's events had swayed her. Rickles turned away from the window as something thumped against the wall that joined his room with Father Long's. He smiled knowingly. The father was in there with the widows, his new brides, making certain their grief didn't cause him to stray from the righteous path. It was exactly the kind of attention Meredith needed to get her back on track. Rickles wished the girl was alone in his room with him right then. He figured he could have thrust the love of Jesus into her for all he was worth. Sighing, he went back to the bed and picked up his hunting rifle. He still couldn't understand why she had run off, especially when she seemed to be warming up to him earlier in the night. Kissing him like she had before he went off to fight, and then teasing him into slipping his hand down her pants and feeling that little muffin of hers. Damn, but that had been sweet. His dick had gotten so hard he'd barely been able to walk along next to her. Without thinking about it, he lifted his hand to his face and sniffed his fingers. He hadn't actually sunk any of his digits into her, but he could smell her. And Lord knew Curtis Rickles had nothing but appreciation for a girl who perfumed her panties. That was for certain. He let his fingers trail across his lips, imagining what the girl's fragrance would be like when he finally got a chance to drink from the furry cup. Suddenly Rickles dropped to his knees alongside the bed and bent forward, his hands clasped in prayer. "Dear Lord," he whispered softly, "I do understand that she's been bad, but please don't bring Meredith up for judgment at the hands of your righteous vessel. Not till I've had a chance to bring her back to the fold. Just give me my chance to make things right. That's all I'm asking. Amen." With his hands still clasped in front of his face, Rickles sniffed once again at Meredith's scent, adorning his fingertips. "And just give me my chance to taste that naughty nectar, Lord." He knew he could set that girl straight, given one more night alone with her. He stood, tugged his pants out from around the bulge between his legs, and picked up his hunting rifle from the bed. He had a patrol to make, and he thought he might just wander off a little at the same time, see if he couldn't find his bride-to-be. As he left his room, Rickles was surprised to find Don James standing in the hallway, a nervous expression on his face. "What are you doing out here, Don?" Rickles asked. "Waiting on a bus?" "Business," Don whispered, flicking his tongue out to wet his dry lips. "I need to discuss something with Father Long." Rickles sized him up. The man was definitely on edge about something. "Looks to me like you're loitering. Why don't you go on downstairs and wait till the father comes down? You know he's busy right now. He doesn't need to be disturbed." I think I'll just wait here." Don leaned back against the wall, dredging up his prison yard cool from deep. His suddenly cold eyes daring Rickles to try him. As much as Rickles would have liked to take the man up on his offer, the congregation didn't need to be fighting amongst themselves at a time like this. "All right, then," Rickles said, nodding. Shutting his bedroom door behind him, the ex-Marine quietly went down the stairs and out into the night. Chapter 14. Meredith stared out across the cold surface of Crystal Lake, watching the way the sparse moonlight reflected on the rippling water. It reminded her of those moving waterfall pictures they sold at the little gift shop in the mall. She had always wanted one of those so she could hang it over her bed and stare at it at night when the lights were out. But they were too expensive, even when the store put them on sale for Christmas. They were beautiful, though. Somehow Meredith thought the real thing didn't seem as pretty. When she slipped out of the cafeteria, she had run and run until she thought her lungs would explode. It didn't matter that she had nowhere to go. She just knew she had to leave the campground, get away from Mr. Rickles and Father Long, and all of the rest of them. Meredith knew she was a sinner, but they were the last people she wanted to hear it from. Besides, they weren't exactly in a position to throw stones from what she could see. Of course, she had hoped she might find Kelly out there, if she were still alive. But then, Kelly would probably be miles away by now, maybe all the way back to town. Maybe she was trying to get help right now, if she was still alive. At first, Meredith had considered trying to run back to town, but the thought that Rickles would probably expect her to do that had brought her up short. She didn't want to make it easy for the creepy old man to find her, but he would never expect her to run off into the forest, not with Jason Voorhees out there. So that's exactly what she had done. Meredith shuddered, still able to feel the touch of his ragged, calloused hands on her belly and down the front of her pants. The idea of what he would have done to her if she hadn't run away made her sick to her stomach. She heard a weird sound from the woods. She turned to look, not really caring what it was as long as it wasn't Mr. Rickles out there looking for her. She feared Jason because of the depth of her sin, but she knew Rickles would only make her more unclean. That's all. Squirrels. She smiled at the memory of Kelly, only to have a sudden wave of despair wash over her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She just wanted to be a normal girl, be back at home, sneaking peeks at MTV whenever her parents weren't around. Her heart sank even further as it occurred to her that she could watch all the MTV she wanted to. Her parents would never be around again. Gazing into the dark woods, Meredith tried to remember some of the stories she'd heard about Jason Voorhees. Father Long, for everything else that was screwed up in his head, had at least gotten one thing right. Jason only killed sinners, people who used drugs and had sex out of wedlock. She hadn't done either one of those things, but she was certainly overflowing with lust, and the worst kind imaginable. You don't fantasize about lying with another girl and still talk your way into heaven. Yeah, right. She was a normal girl, as normal as a sexual deviant can be. It might not be too late for her, though. She had never actually done the deed, although she had touched herself plenty of times while thinking about it, and that was pretty bad. But if she tried hard, maybe she could still earn forgiveness from the Lord. All she had to do was pass judgment, after all. Meredith turned around to look at Crystal Lake again. A gentle breeze blew across the water, setting the surface of the lake to a shimmering under the moonlight. Just like the pictures at the mall. She was wrong. It was beautiful, even with the murders. She didn't like to think about people dying, especially not her mom and dad. But if it was the Lord's will, then how could it be anything but beautiful? She thought that she was starting to sound like Father Long. Maybe she was crazy. Or maybe he wasn't? Frustrated, Meredith dropped to her knees on the water's edge. She dug her fingers into the wet sand, scooping up handfuls and letting it fall again. Why was it all so confusing? Everything was so messed up. Starting with why she felt the way she did about Kelly. Why would God do that to her, make her feel that way, if it was so wrong? Unless it was a test. Maybe he did it to everybody. Maybe she just had to make herself not like Kelly in that way. Not want to hold her and touch her and kiss her. Bad. She was being bad again, letting her dirty thoughts run away with her. Meredith clenched her fist tightly, squeezing the handfuls of sand she held into hard little clumps. She had to let the word out, the word she never wanted to say or even think about. Maybe that would help make it go away. Lesbian, she whispered. She felt a cold sting in her mouth, like touching her tongue to a battery. How could one little word encompass so much guilt? It even scared Kelly. Maybe not the word itself, but when Meredith had touched her the day before, had it only been the day before, she had definitely been freaked out. And Meredith was pretty sure that Kelly had done practically everything, at least all the stuff you would for sure get sent to hell for doing. Dropping the handfuls of packed sand, Meredith stared at the ground for a moment. Then, with her index finger, she reached out and wrote the word in the sand in front of her. It was okay, because the water would erase it and no one would ever know. The water of Crystal Lake would wash it away, and, if she was lucky, take her sin along with it. Meredith cocked her head and read the word over and over again, until it didn't even seem like a word anymore. I have lust in my heart for Kelly Mills, she confessed to herself. Say it out loud. She was going to have to say it out loud or it wouldn't go away. I have lust in my heart for Kelly Mills, Meredith whispered, so softly that she almost made no sound at all. Her heart pounded in her chest. I have lust in my heart for Kelly Mills, she repeated, louder this time, the sound of her own voice sending a chill up her spine. If it was lust for a boy, would it still be a sin? Or could she pretend it wasn't lust then, just puppy love or a crush or something? God would still know it was lust, so why was feeling it for another girl so much worse? It was the same emotion, the same sin. God knew about it either way, so why did it anger him more if it was directed at a girl? Meredith read the word in the sand again. Lesbian. Lesbian. Her parents were normal, a man and a woman, just as God intended it to be. Then why did they have to die? Her mom and dad were normal, and they loved and feared their God, and they still died. Angrily, Meredith clawed at the sand, wiping the word away. Then it struck her. How could her parents be normal if they had given birth to her? That had to be the answer. Her mom and dad had suffered for her sins, died for her sins, which made her sins all the more consuming. The word couldn't stop coming now that she'd let it out. Lesbian, lesbian, sinner. She willed herself to say it out loud. Lesbian, Meredith muttered. It was like a snake crawling out of her mouth. She had sinned with her perversion and her lustful thoughts and her masturbation, and her parents had died because of it, because of her. Tears spilled from her eyes. She had to offer herself up for judgment if there was to be any hope for her immortal soul. Had her sins damned her parents to eternal torment? Meredith stood up and looked out across God's creation, the water, the earth, the sky, and sobbed violently, her body shuddering. Slowly she reached up and began unbuttoning her blouse, her fingers trembling so bad she could barely perform the task. Unfastening the last button, she peeled her shirt off and cast it aside. Then, reaching back, she undid the catch on her bra and removed the undergarment, dropping it to the ground. Her nipples hardened painfully under the cool breeze, but she resisted the temptation to fold her arms protectively across her breast. Lesbian. Sinner. Meredith kicked off her shoes and bent to remove her socks. They joined her bra and blouse in the pile. Unzipping her jeans, she slowly pushed them down, stepping out of them, and laying them with the rest of her clothes. Weeping softly, Meredith stared straight ahead as she removed her panties and tossed them away. She stood naked before the Lord. I have lust in my heart, she said, sniffling. Kneeling once again, she said a quiet prayer, asking God to forgive her sins. Then, wiping the tears from her face, she stood and turned towards the shadowy forest. Jason, she whispered. Jason, I'm ready to face your judgment now. The strike team moved vigilantly through the woods, despite their distance from Camp Crystal Lake. Besides the potential threat of ambush from the religious freaks, Hobb knew that Jason Voorhees could spring out like a murderous machete-wielding jack-in-the-box at any fucking second. Ah, the beauty of nature. Hob was learning very quickly just how much he hated the woods, not to mention people. He sighed. More and more, he found himself wishing he had listened to Lauren and given up the agency. Since they'd planned to force him out, he probably could have collected a fat unemployment check until his banged-up eyeball healed, then found some kind of quiet job working at a record store. Except he hated rap music even more than he hated the woods, hated people, and he'd probably get stuck working someplace where that was all they played. How come nobody listened to the Kinks anymore? Or Sweet? Hob loved Sweet, especially Fox on the Run. The only time he'd taken up the mic on karaoke night at the bowling alley, he'd belted out a drunkenly beautiful version of Fox on the Run that had the audience shrieking like he was all for the Beatles. You can bet your ass he wouldn't have gotten a reaction like that if he'd been singing some piece of shit by Ja Rule or someone. And on top of everything else, with the delicate tap dance Samantha Noon had done on his face, he wasn't sure his eyeball would ever heal. Hob prodded cautiously at the bulging flesh around his right eye. He had opted not to use his night vision goggles since his face was so badly swollen, and he could only see out of one eye anyway. He figured he'd rely on the rest of the team to see shit that needed shooting. At least he was alive. If it were possible, Hob's mood darkened even further. Lauren was going to be demolished when he told her Jeff Townsend had been killed. She had adored Townsend. The man was like a particularly large big brother to her. Hob's guts twisted themselves up in a throbbing knot of despondency. He'd worked hard to stay focused on the mission, but now the realization that he would never sit down for a beer or shoot another painfully one-sided game of basketball with the big man was really cutting into him. Townsend was gone, a ghost, and Hob had been sitting on his ass in his armored platoon troop transport when it happened. Looking around at the other members of the strike team, Hob tried to put his mind back to the situation at hand, shake away the melancholy. That shit gets people killed, he thought. Noon was on point, and Garb brought up the rear, the other operators spreading out, leapfrogging as they moved through the trees. Kelly was sticking close to Hob, to the point where a couple of times already her feet had wound up under his as he was trying to walk. She talked a big story, but Hob could easily see she was scared shitless. Her eyes darted around in the darkness, jumping at every sound. He had offered her the use of his night vision goggles, but she said that she didn't want to see things that clearly. Considering what she had been through, he couldn't really blame her. He had a laundry list of questions he wanted to ask the woman, but it would be a dumb move to start chattering away. Not only would the sound give away their position, but it would be easy to get distracted by the conversation and get caught with their pants down. He glanced at Kelly. If he was going to get caught with his pants down, Hob could think of a lot worse people to have it happen with, though. She was really something. No Lauren, of course, and no way was he considering for even a moment the possibility of cheating on his wife. But he wasn't a dead man either. The religious chick was stacked to the gills, no two ways about it, and it certainly didn't hurt to appreciate the view. And he wasn't all that convinced about where she stood in the eyes of the Lord anyways. She could swear like a sailor, and from some of the things she had said earlier, he got the impression that she thought a lot of the other folks in her congregation of loonies were, well, exactly that, loonies. Yes, sir, a lot of questions indeed. At the front of the team, Samantha Noon paused near a large tree and signaled to Mar. The man hustled forward, taking the point position as Noon fell back alongside Hob. "Through the trees there, 2 o'clock, she whispered, pointing off in the darkness. They continued walking as they spoke, keeping pace with the team. Hob and Kelly followed the line of her arm, but saw nothing. "No night vision, remember?" Hob asked, tapping his temple above his inflated eye socket. He winced at the pain, feeling stupid. Noon grinned at him behind her bulky night vision goggles. "Right." She nodded in the direction she'd pointed. "That's where Jason Voorhees jumped our shit." With the slightest whistle, Hob halted the team. The operators scanned the night expectantly, searching for trouble. Hob gave them the nod, easing their nerves, and turned to Noon. "That's where Seaver was killed." Hob felt his face redden. Seaver was a douchebag of the highest order, but he didn't deserve to be hacked up like a Thanksgiving turkey. And Samantha Noon sure as hell didn't deserve to witness it. "Yeah," she said, her face tight. "That's where he bought it." Hob stared into the coal black lenses of her goggles. "I'll make sure you get your shot." "Do that." Giving the woman a quick nod, Hob looked off into the darkness on their left. "How far are we from the lake here?" "Not sure," Noon answered. "Road's off to her left, maybe half a click." "What's half a click?" Kelly interrupted. Noon's goggles slowly tilted so she could gaze at Kelly. "About 1,500 feet." I don't think the road's that far, Kelly answered. I've been trying to figure it out in my head while we've been walking, counting it off, kind of. All right, Miss Human Computer, what do you come up with? Noon challenged. Kelly glanced slyly at Hob. Well, I'm not sure exactly. Then why are we discussing it? Noon asked. I think it's more like a quarter of a mile. At least where we're at now, but the road curves down towards the lake, and then sort of follows that until it comes to the ministry, to Camp Crystal Lake. She looked at Hob. So if we keep going the way we are now, we'll wind up further from it before we come back to it. Does that make sense? Give me a minute, Hob said. Jesus, he might as well have asked her all those questions that were eating at him. If there was anybody around to hear, whoever it was would be on their trail by now. Unconsciously, Hob glanced around. The tree cover really kept the moonlight to a minimum. He could barely see 10 feet in any direction. Anybody could be out there watching them. I think we should head back towards the road, follow it until we can see the lake. Otherwise, we're liable to lose our bearings out here, wind up overshooting the campground, or worse yet, stumble right into it. Noon shook her head. They could have the God Squad stationed all along that road, just waiting for us. Then that'll give us somebody to shoot at, Hob said, putting an end to the discussion. Besides, he said, trying to wink at Kelly, but realizing he was just blinking his one good eye, it's only a quarter of a click away. Are you afraid of a little hump? Fuck, Noon replied. I want to see Seaver's body, Hob said. Then we'll get a move on. Kelly liked this soldier guy, Hob. Not like the beer, after all. She couldn't believe she was out here in the goddamn woods with him and his buddies heading back to Camp Crystal Lake, but she did like him. What had he called himself? An operator? Yeah, I bet he's an operator, she thought. If you positioned yourself so you couldn't see that creepy eye of his, he was a damn fine-looking fella. A little short, maybe. No, she told herself, she didn't like him in that way. He just seemed like a good guy, a straight shooter, which is exactly what she thought about Father Eric Long, until recent events altered that opinion. With her track record where men were concerned, maybe she should start dating Meredith. Just give the kid a couple of years before they went all the way, so she didn't buy herself a jail sentence to go along with the carpet munching. Ah, Meredith, she thought. I hope to Christ you're okay. Kelly felt like her heart had been clamped in a very large fist ever since she ran away from the old-fashioned revival meeting and the God-sanctioned Jason Voorhees bloodbath earlier that night. She should have grabbed the girl, dragged her out of there kicking and screaming if she'd had to. Now she just hoped they'd find her before it was too late. Kelly followed Operator Hob, trying not to stare at his ass in an attempt to figure out what it looked like beneath his unflattering black fatigues, as the team marched off toward their fallen buddy. For some reason she couldn't fathom, the commandos or operators, or whatever they wanted to call themselves, felt the need to go look at a guy they already knew was dead, and just about the last thing Kelly wanted to see was someone who had been chopped up by Jason Voorhees. But she sure as hell wasn't going to hang back alone in the dark forest while the others went off to look at the butchery. So she went along, practically clinging to Hob's arm and feeling a little bit embarrassed about it. As they moved into a small clearing, Kelly could make out a frightening shape sprawled on the ground. Fuck, Noon shouted, bending suddenly and snatching up a rock or stick and hurling it towards the corpse. Kelly saw something scurry away from the body and disappear into the darkness. She forgot the others had those night vision goggles and could see a hell of a lot better than she could. She was glad she hadn't accepted a pair when Hob had offered. Fucking raccoon, Noon said, turning towards Hob. It was eating his goddamn face. Kelly winced. The horror she'd experienced came flooding back all at once, pounding against her like an angry crowd storming a building. She suddenly wanted very much to curl up on the ground and cover her head. Hey, Hob said softly. Tearing her gaze away from the shape on the ground, Kelly looked at the operator. Smiling, he nodded to her, indicating her tight grip on the sleeve of his coveralls. Oh, Kelly said, feeling foolish. He wanted to go to the body, and she'd been clinging so tightly to him he couldn't get away. Just like every relationship she'd ever had, really. Clingy Kelly. She let go and watched Hob walk towards the corpse, kneeling alongside it. He quickly averted his gaze, looking like he might throw up. Holy Jesus! Hob muttered, putting his fist to his mouth. Staring at the ground, he addressed Noon. Did you get his gear, grenades, ammo? Then he threw up. Off to Kelly's left, Sisson suddenly let fly with a torrential stream of sympathy puke. He leaned forward, putting his hands on his knees, and spat a couple of times. Sorry, he mumbled, not looking at the others. It always happens. Samantha Noon sneered at the man's weakness and answered Hob's question. Yeah, we got everything. What was that? Kelly interrupted, staring off into the dark woods. She had heard something off in the distance, a voice, a familiar voice. I didn't hear anything, Noon said gruffly. I heard it. Hob rose, peering into the night. Goggles, he ordered. Garb, closest to him, removed his night vision gear and handed the goggles over. Hob lifted them to his good eye and scanned the area where the sound had come from. There it is again, Kelly shouted, her heart leaping. Keep it down, Noon hissed. Meredith, it had to be. She'd recognized the kid's sweet-natured voice anywhere. Suddenly, Kelly took off running. What are you doing? Noon grabbed at her, but Kelly slipped the woman's grasp and was gone through the trees. Hob wiped puke from his chin and started after Kelly, calling back over his shoulder to Samantha Noon. Take him to the road and hold position there. We'll catch up. Noon took a few steps after her commanding officer. But what if it's Jason? Hob didn't answer, mostly because he didn't want to entertain the possibility, but also because he had seen the look on Kelly's face. She knew who was out there, and she was worried about whoever it was. Holding the night vision goggles to his left eye, he watched Kelly race through the forest as he followed. She was running like a gazelle, darting in and out between the trees and bounding over any obstacles in her path. Pretty good for a chick in a sundress. Hob couldn't catch the woman. At one point he snagged a boot on a fallen log, hitting the ground face first, almost losing Kelly before he could get back on his feet and move again. The fall reopened the cuts on his face, and blood was streaming down his cheek and neck once again. He swore. At this rate, he was going to need the entire right side of his head amputated and replaced with fiberglass. The trees thinned, and he saw Kelly dash out across the dirt road ahead. Had they come that far already? Maybe they were both hearing things. Maybe there wasn't anything out there after all. Either that, or sound just carried a long way out here. As Hob burst from the tree line, he was relieved to see Kelly standing in the middle of the road. The woman was gasping for breath and spinning around, looking in every direction. Hob caught up to her, breathing hard. All right. Jesse fucking Owens. Let's listen for a minute, okay? Kelly nodded breathlessly. They both tried to quell their heavy breathing as they peered into the trees on either side of the road. There, and then gone. Hob knew he'd seen it, though. A bright white figure moving through the forest on the lake side of the road, and he was sure as hell it wasn't Jason Voorhees. Come on, he said, grabbing Kelly's arm and leading her on into the woods. As they tromped through the trees, they heard it again, a girl's voice. And unless Hob was mistaken, she was calling for Jason. Meredith, Kelly called. The girl's voice stopped. Hob and Kelly paused, listening, trying to get their bearings. He hadn't seen the ghostly figure since they'd left the road. Then softly, uncertainly, Kelly? Ahead to the right, Kelly was out of his grasp and running through the trees once again. Meredith! The pale figure came into view again, and Hob felt his stomach do a somersault. He flung the night vision goggles to the ground and stared at her under the moonlight. A teenage girl, he thought, naked as a jaybird. Oh my God, you're okay, Kelly shouted, racing forward to embrace the girl. Hob averted his eyes, feeling the rage building inside him. I thought you were dead. They told me you were dead, Meredith said, tears pouring from her eyes. Yeah, well, they're a bunch of goddamn liars. You should know that by now. Kelly eased her grip on the girl, stepping back to look at her. What are you doing out here like this? Ashamed, Meredith tried to cover herself with her hands. That's what I'd like to know, Hob snarled. How old is this girl? He spun, addressing the question to Meredith. How old are you? Meredith's lips trembled. 17, she whispered. Jesus Christ, Hob said, unfastening his bulletproof vest and flinging it aside, followed by his helmet. Kelly's eyes widened as Hob unzipped his coveralls. What the hell are you doing? Hob pulled his coveralls open and wriggled out of the sleeves. Getting her something to wear. He pulled his sleeveless white undershirt off and threw it to Kelly. It probably smells like hell, but put it on. Kelly stared for a moment at the brutal scars that adorned Hob's torso like a road map. Then she gave the wife-beater t-shirt to Meredith, who turned away demurely and slipped into it. Hob wasn't any taller than the girl, but the shirt tail was long enough that with a little stretching it covered what it needed to. What the hell kind of scumbags are up there at that little church of yours, he snapped at Kelly, making a 17-year-old girl run around naked, and God only knows what else. How the hell did you get involved with them? You seem like a pretty smart girl otherwise, but this, I tell you, I'm fucking baffled. Not to mention royally pissed off. Kelly stammered for a second. Before she could frame a response, Meredith spoke up. They didn't make me get naked, she said quietly, and Kelly's not like them. Zipping his coveralls back up, Hob stepped to the girl. What's your name? Meredith. Meredith. So they didn't make you get naked, but they still allowed it? What in the hell was going on, Hob thought. It might be a nice way to pass the rest of the evening if he could saunter into Camp Crystal Lake and shoot everybody in the face. No, Meredith explained. They don't know. I did it myself out here by the lake. Kelly stroked the girl's hair. But why, honey? Meredith stared timidly at Kelly. To make myself, to be pure in front of the Lord. Hob rolled his single eye. Holy sweet Jesus in a Hummer. I had to be pure, unadorned, so I could face judgment for my sins, Meredith said. Oh, no, Kelly said, grabbing the girl and pulling her into an embrace. No, no, no. She pulled away, looking into Meredith's eyes. You were out here looking for Jason? What the fuck for? Hob asked. Sorry about the language. It's okay, Meredith sniffled. Kelly does it all the time. Kelly looked at Hob. It's like I told you. Long believes Jason Voorhees is the hand of God and the motherfucker is here to pass judgment on unclean souls. Do you really believe that, Meredith? Hob knelt in front of the anguished girl. He's a killer, a murderer. There's nothing holy about Jason Voorhees. Unholy, maybe. But I can assure you that he, without the slightest doubt, is not the hand of God. Meredith fought back tears. I don't know. I don't know what I believe anymore. All I know is that my mom and dad they're dead. Oh, baby, Kelly interjected, holding the girl closer. I'm so sorry. Everybody in the church is crazy, and Mr. Rickles he's trying to touch me and do stuff to me. Rickles? Hob asked, looking to Kelly for confirmation. He's a real sleazebag. I think he used to be a Marine, Kelly told him. No offense, she hastily added. It's not that I think he's a sleazebag because he was a Marine. I know what you mean, Hob said, waving her off. That might explain why a bunch of religious freaks could pull off a successful ambush against a trained strike team, he realized. Meredith wiped her nose. Hob stood up, shaking his head. Don't you worry, little girl. I'm putting this Mr. Rickles guy on my goddamn list of things to do today. I'm not a little girl, she sniffled. Yeah, I can see that, Hob thought. And apparently so could this Rickles character. If an ex-jarhead really was calling the shots, then it might be a simple matter of taking him out of the picture to bring a quick end to a conflict with the church folk, or at least send them running around like the proverbial chickens, minus their heads, unable to figure out what direction to point their guns. A simple solution to a complex problem. Of course, Hob could never be that lucky. I'm sorry, Hob told Meredith. I know you're not. He pretended not to notice her erect nipples jutting through the fabric of his t-shirt. You've got to be cold, though. Oh my God, he thought. I can't believe I just said that. What do you say we get out of here? Oh God, Kelly said quietly, a stunned expression on her face. Hob looked at the woman. She was staring somewhere past Meredith's right shoulder. Following her gaze, he suddenly felt very cold himself. Jason stood in the shadows not 20 feet away, watching them intently. Get out of here, Hob whispered to Kelly and Meredith. Go! As if triggered by Hob's words, Jason lunged forward, raising his machete for action. Run! Hob yelled, lifting his gun. Meredith screamed. Hob squeezed the trigger. The roar of the FN MK-46 drowned the girl out as it spat flame and fury. The 5.56 caliber slugs tearing up the trees all around the advancing killer, pounding into his body. Gripping the girl's hand, Kelly ran, hauling Meredith back towards the road. Round after round slammed into Jason's torso. Chunks of meat burst from his body, accompanied by spurting ribbons of blood. The assault rocked the masked madman in his tracks, but slowed him down only a small amount. Hobbs' finger clenched the trigger. The gun jerked and rattled in his grip. No way, he thought. No way am I not hitting something vital. Why won't he stop? The legs! Take out the legs! Lowering the barrel of his rifle slightly, Hobb continued to unleash the withering onslaught of hot lead. Following the gun's motion, a trail of bullets tracked down Jason's belly and across his crotch, sending up a fireworks show of gore. The slugs ate into the killer's thighs. The impact so strong it knocked his leg out from under him. Hobb rejoiced silently as Jason was hurled face down in the dirt, slamming to the ground with a brutal impact. Not letting up, Hobb poured lead into the psychopath's broad back. Blood shot skywards like a gory lawn sprinkler. Still, Hobb continued to fire, gun crazy, until his magazine was spent. Fuck! Hobb swore. He expelled the spent ammo cassette and went to his vest pocket for another. It was then that he realized his vest was still on the ground where he had dropped it when he'd given his undershirt to Meredith, and he hadn't loaded the belt feed on the rifle. Unbelievably, Jason was getting to his feet. Hob darted to where his vest lay in the dirt, then glanced at Jason. The motherfucker is almost up. Hob checked a pocket. No, that's a frag grenade. And he's too fucking close for a frag grenade. And where the hell's my goddamn ammo? With the vest bunched up, he couldn't be sure where he had stored anything. And he didn't really want to take his eyes off Jason, who was up on his feet and coming at Hob again. Jason looked seriously pissed off, and his machete looked extremely sharp. Hob jumped up, ready to split. The vest slipped from his grasp, dropping to the ground once again. He bounced on one foot for a moment, torn between making another grab for the vest or simply getting the hell out of there. A glance at the hulking maniac striding towards him settled it. Hob took off running, nearly falling over Samantha Noon in the process. Okay, this has been Friday the 13th, Church of the Divine Psychopath, chapters 13 and 14. I hope you're enjoying it so far. We're into the home stretch now. We've only got 6 more chapters to go before we move on to our next novel, which, if you heard yesterday's video, you know is a Nightmare on Elm Street novel. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment on each video for a chance to win this book, Church of the Divine Psychopath. It is my only copy, and once we hit 100 subs, then I will be picking a subscriber based on their interaction and comments on the videos, and I will give them this book for free as a gift. Spread the word out there. Let's get more people to experience these great books. Be sure to click the bell so you have notification of new chapters coming. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time.